A gang of white men stood at the entrance of the grocery store, their eyes locked onto the elderly black woman as if she were an intruder in a place she had every right to be. The air was thick with unspoken words, but the tension was louder than any of them. She clutched her purse close to her chest, her wrinkled fingers tightening around the strap, her heart pounding in a way it hadn't in years, not since the days when she had to sit at the back of the bus, when she had to drink from separate fountains, when she was told her place over and over again by men who looked just like them. She had thought those days were over. She had believed that time had buried those ghosts. But standing here, beneath the cold fluorescent lights of a store she had shopped at for decades, she realized some ghosts never truly die. They just learn how to smile while they spit in your face. You need to leave. The cashier's voice was steady, indifferent, as if he were asking someone to put back a misplaced item on the wrong shelf. Her eyes flickered up to his face. He was young, barely out of his 20s, but the smirk on his lips was old. It was the same smirk she had seen on the faces of boys in the 60s who threw rocks at her as she walked home from school. The same smirk that said, "I have power over you, and there's nothing you can do about it." "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice calm but firm, though she could already feel the weight of the situation pressing against her ribs, making it harder to breathe. "You're making people uncomfortable," the young man said, his smirk never faltering. Her eyes swept across the store. A few customers had stopped in the aisles, watching but saying nothing. Some looked away quickly, pretending they hadn't seen anything at all. A woman with 2 kids shifted uncomfortably but did nothing. And then there were the ones who stood there, arms crossed, enjoying the show. "I'm just here to buy my groceries," she said, refusing to let her voice shake, even as she felt the ground beneath her shift in a way she hadn't felt in years. The man behind her laughed, stepping closer. She recognized him now. He had been following her since she walked in, hovering in the aisles like a shadow she couldn't shake. He wasn't just another shopper. He was waiting for something. "We don't serve troublemakers," the cashier added. "And we don't need people like you causing problems here. People like her." She had heard those words her entire life. "People like you don't belong here. People like you should know their place. People like you should stay out of sight, out of mind, out of our world." "I'm paying for my things just like everybody else," she said, holding her basket tighter, as if it were a shield. "You heard him, lady," the man behind her said, stepping so close she could smell the staleness of his breath. "Get out." Her heart pounded in her chest, not with fear, but with something else. Something deeper. Something that had been buried for years but never truly went away. She turned to leave, not because they had won, but because she knew how these things ended. She had seen enough blood on the pavement in her lifetime to know that this was a fight she wouldn't win today. But then, as she took a step toward the door, one of them bumped into her, knocking her basket from her hands. Apples rolled across the floor. A carton of milk burst open, spilling across the tiles like a wound torn open. The store went silent. She closed her eyes for half a second, forcing herself to swallow the anger that rose like bile in her throat. She had spent her entire life swallowing it. "You people always make a mess," the man sneered, looking down at her, towering over her as if he had every right to. Something inside her snapped. She reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and dialed a number. It rang once. Twice. Then, a voice answered. "Mama?" Her breath steadied. "I need you." The response was immediate. "Where are you?" She told him. And then, she waited. The men behind her laughed, muttering something about how she thought her son could do something, how she was just an old lady who should have known better than to think she was equal to them. They had no idea who they had just messed with. Minutes passed. And then, the doors of the store swung open. The laughter stopped. The arrogance drained from their faces. What happened next would leave an entire town speechless. And those men? Those men who thought they could humiliate her and walk away untouched. They were about to learn that sometimes, the past doesn't just stay buried. Sometimes, it comes back with a badge. At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism in all its forms. This channel is a space where powerful stories are told, justice prevails, and the voices of those who have been silenced are heard. To every Black viewer watching this, know that you are valued, respected, and never alone. Now, get ready for a gripping story of resilience and justice. If you enjoy stories with powerful twists, make sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Let's dive in. Enjoy the story. Dolores Carter had lived long enough to know the patterns of history. Born in the heart of Mississippi in 1943, she had seen it all: the marches, the protests, the violence that came when people like her dared to exist in spaces they weren't supposed to. She had grown up knowing the weight of silence, the power of a lowered gaze, the necessity of knowing when to speak and when to simply endure. But Dolores was never one to endure quietly. Even as a young girl, she had questioned, had challenged, had refused to accept that she was worth any less than the people who looked down on her. Time had carved deep lines into her face, but none of them were from surrender. They were from resilience, from survival. She had moved to Texas in the late 70s, settling into a small but comfortable home in a neighborhood that, at first, had tolerated her presence but never truly welcomed it. Over the years, she had outlived most of the people who once muttered about her behind closed doors. She had built a life here, watching her son, Elijah, grow into a man she was proud of. He had always been smart, always been strong, but most importantly, he had always understood the world for what it was, not for what people pretended it to be. That was why he had joined the FBI. Elijah Carter was not a man of many words. His job had made him precise, calculating. He had learned to read people in an instant, to recognize threats before they became dangerous. It was a skill he had honed since childhood, growing up as a Black boy in America, where being aware of your surroundings was not just a lesson but a survival tactic. His mother had taught him that. She had raised him to be better, to be smarter, to never let anger guide his decisions, but to never back down either. Elijah had seen the kind of men his mother had encountered at the grocery store before. They weren't new. They were just remnants of an old disease that refused to die. He had spent years tracking their kind, men who thrived on the illusion of superiority, who clung to their hatred like it was the only thing keeping them alive. Some of them wore masks, others didn't bother. Some of them hid behind laws, others made their own rules. But they all had one thing in common. They believed they were untouchable. The town of Mayfield wasn't big, but it was divided in ways that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The older folks knew where they could go and where they weren't welcome. The younger generation pushed back, but the roots of the past were still deep, still tangled in the foundation of the place. There were stores Dolores didn't enter, not because there were signs keeping her out, but because the air inside told her she wasn't wanted. She had learned, long ago, how to listen to what wasn't being said. But she had stopped caring about all that. At 79, she had no patience for playing games with men who thought they could dictate where she belonged. She had walked into that grocery store because she had every right to be there, because she had spent her life making sure that people like her didn't have to ask permission to exist. What she hadn't expected was the hostility. Not like that. Not so open, so unashamed. Gary Latham had been watching her the moment she stepped through the doors. He had seen her around town before, had heard the way people spoke about her. An old woman, living alone, walking around like she owned the place. It didn't sit right with him. His father would have never allowed it. His grandfather would have made sure she knew her place. But the world had changed, and men like him had been forced into the shadows. Still, that didn't mean they had disappeared. Gary and his friends had made the grocery store their regular spot. They didn't own it, but they might as well have. The owner never told them to leave, never questioned the way they lingered near the entrance, sizing people up, deciding who did and didn't belong. The rules were unspoken, but they were clear. When Dolores entered, something in him itched. She walked with confidence, her head high, her movements deliberate. Like she didn't care that the world had rules. Like she thought she was untouchable. Gary hated that. He had leaned in close to his friends, muttering something low enough to make them chuckle, something about how some people needed reminders, about how history had a way of correcting itself. He followed her through the aisles, not hiding the way he loomed, the way he made his presence known. He wanted her to feel it. By the time she reached the register, the tension had already thickened. He watched as the cashier, a kid who had grown up learning the same lessons as him, straightened his shoulders and made his move. "You need to leave." The words rang louder than they should have, bouncing off the walls, settling into the ears of everyone in the store. Dolores had turned, confused at first, then angry. She wasn't naive. She knew what this was. But knowing didn't make it any easier to swallow. She had argued, had stood her ground, but the weight of all those eyes pressing down on her, waiting for her to fold, made her chest tighten. She had felt this before, years ago, when she was a child and a store owner had told her mother that they didn't serve her kind. History repeating itself. Gary had stepped closer then, enjoying the way she had to tilt her head to look up at him. "You heard him, lady. Get out." She should have left. She should have walked away. But Dolores Carter had spent her entire life being told to move, to step aside, to shrink herself into spaces too small for her dignity. She wasn't about to start now. And then, the basket hit the ground. The sound was sharp, louder than it should have been, echoing in the silence that followed. She saw the amusement in their eyes, the satisfaction. That was when she made the call. Gary and his friends had laughed at first. An old woman, dialing up her son like he could do something. But then, the doors swung open. And the laughter stopped. The moment the grocery store doors swung open, the air in the room changed. The laughter, the sneers, the quiet amusement that had been painted on their faces drained almost instantly, replaced with something colder, something that hadn't been there before, uncertainty. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in their expressions, a slight shift in their stance, but Dolores saw it. She felt it. And for the first time since this entire ordeal had started, she knew they had made a mistake. The man who stepped inside wasn't in uniform. He didn't need to be. Everything about him, from the way he carried himself to the way his eyes swept across the room, told them exactly what kind of man he was. Elijah Carter was not the kind of man you wanted to cross. He wasn't the kind of man who made threats. He was the kind of man who let silence do the talking, let his presence settle in like a warning. His mother had raised him that way. To never show anger first. To let people make their own assumptions about what he was capable of before he proved them right. He didn't move right away. He didn't have to. The store was still, the tension thick enough to feel like it was pressing against the walls. He locked eyes with his mother first, a silent question passing between them, but she didn't answer it. She didn't have to. Everything he needed to know was already written in the way she stood, in the way her hand still gripped the strap of her purse like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Then, his gaze shifted. Gary Latham had been laughing not 5 minutes ago. Now, his fingers twitched at his sides, and Elijah caught the way his throat bobbed when he swallowed. "You called your boy, huh?" Gary's voice wasn't as confident as before, but he tried to mask it with a chuckle, nodding toward Dolores as if she was just some old woman who had overreacted. "Thought he was gonna do something." Elijah didn't answer. Gary let out another forced laugh, trying to re-establish control of a situation that was already slipping through his fingers. "Ain't no reason for you to be here, man. We were just talking, that's all. Just a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Elijah had heard that one before. It was the excuse of men who got caught too early, before they could finish what they started. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke, but it cut through the room like a knife. "What did you do to her?" Gary scoffed, shaking his head like the entire thing was ridiculous. "Man, you're really gonna act like she didn't start this? We don't need people like her coming in here, acting like they own the place." Elijah's eyes darkened, and Gary shut his mouth before he could finish the sentence. "Smart." One of the other men, younger but just as arrogant, took a step forward, trying to reclaim the moment. "Look, she wasn't listening to the cashier, all right? That's all it was. Nobody put hands on her, nobody." Elijah cut him off with a look, and the man faltered, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of it. "I don't need to hear your version of what happened," Elijah said, his voice level. "I already know." The quiet stretched between them, the weight of it making the air feel heavy. "Is that right?" Gary finally said, trying to regain some of the bravado he had lost. "And what are you going to do about it?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, studying him. "Who do you think you're talking to?" Something about the way he said it made Gary pause, made him hesitate just long enough for the confidence to slip from his voice again. Elijah didn't break eye contact. "You think you can do whatever you want because no one's ever made you answer for it. Because you've never had to be afraid. You think the world belongs to you, that you can decide who gets to exist in it without consequence." He took a step forward, just one, but it was enough to make Gary flinch. "But that ends today." The other men shifted, glancing at each other, waiting for Gary to do something, say something, but he just stood there, his jaw tightening. Elijah exhaled slowly, as if giving them a moment to let the weight of the situation settle in. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his badge and holding it up just enough for them to see. That was when the fear set in. Real fear. Gary's face paled. Elijah let the silence stretch a little longer before he spoke again. "I suggest you don't move." The store was deathly quiet. The cashier, who had been so smug just moments ago, looked like he wanted to disappear. The few customers who had stayed behind weren't even pretending to shop anymore. They were watching, waiting, holding their breath. Elijah let the moment linger before he turned his attention back to his mother. "Mama," he said, his voice softer now, "you all right?" Dolores nodded, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just watched as her son, the boy she had raised to be better, to be stronger, took control of a moment that could have broken her. Elijah turned back to Gary, his expression unreadable. "I want every name. Every person in this town who thinks they can do what you just did without consequence. Because I promise you, I'm not leaving until I have them." Gary didn't answer. He just stood there, jaw clenched, hands curled into fists. Elijah smiled, but there was no humor in it. "That's fine. We'll start with you." And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the moment shattered. The front doors of the store swung open again. And this time, Elijah wasn't alone. The sound of heavy boots against the tile floor sent a ripple through the room. The silence that had once been thick with tension was now suffocating. The moment the doors swung open for the second time, the weight of the situation shifted entirely. Elijah didn't even need to turn around to know that his men had arrived. He had called them the second he stepped foot inside, knowing exactly what kind of situation he was walking into. He knew how these men operated, how they thought they were untouchable in towns like this, how they had never faced real consequences for their actions. Until now. Gary Latham's breath hitched, his shoulders stiffening as he caught sight of the men stepping in behind Elijah, FBI agents, all of them. They weren't uniformed officers. There were no local cops here, no good OL boys who would pat him on the back and tell him to be more careful next time. These were federal agents, men and women who had seen things far worse than this, who weren't interested in playing small-town politics or brushing things under the rug. Elijah didn't break his gaze from Gary as he spoke, his voice steady, calm. "Do you know what the difference is between people like you and people like me?" Gary's jaw clenched, but he didn't answer. Elijah took a slow step forward. People like you think the world owes you something. That the rules don't apply. That you can get away with anything because no one has ever stopped you before. His voice dropped lower, the weight of it pressing against Gary like an iron grip. But today, you're going to learn what it feels like to be powerless. Gary's friends shifted, their bravado crumbling piece by piece as the agents fanned out, their movements precise, calculated. They weren't here to ask questions. They weren't here to negotiate. One of the younger men, no older than 25, scoffed, though his voice lacked the confidence he had before. "This is ridiculous, man. You can't just, shut up," Gary muttered, but it was too late. Elijah turned his attention to the man who had spoken. "You think this is ridiculous?" His expression didn't change, but his voice carried something sharp, something unforgiving. "You think it's ridiculous that your actions have consequences? That you don't get to humiliate and intimidate people without answering for it?" The young man's face hardened, but he stayed silent. Elijah shifted his attention back to Gary. "Tell me something. How long have you been doing this? How many people have you threatened? How many times have you walked away without a second thought?" Gary didn't answer, but Elijah could see the muscle in his jaw twitching, the barely contained frustration, the realization that he wasn't in control anymore. "You thought this was just another day, didn't you?" Elijah continued, his voice dangerously calm. "You thought you'd get a few laughs, push around an elderly woman, feel like a man for a few minutes." He took another step forward. "But you made a mistake. You picked the wrong woman. And now, you're going to answer for it." One of the agents stepped beside Elijah, a tablet in his hand. He held it up just enough for Gary to see. "We've been watching you for a while, Mr. Latham," the agent said, his tone devoid of emotion. "You and your little crew here." He swiped across the screen, revealing images, photos taken over months, maybe even years. Gary's face was in several of them. So were the faces of the men standing behind him. One of the other agents spoke, her voice crisp, professional. "We have records of online conversations, evidence of coordinated harassment, threats, even ties to extremist groups. We know exactly who you are." Gary's face paled, his hands curling into fists at his sides. Elijah smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You thought you were untouchable. But let me be very clear about something." He leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure his words hit like a sledgehammer. "Your life as you knew it. It's over." The shift in the room was palpable. The men who had walked in with so much arrogance, so much entitlement, were now realizing the depth of the trouble they were in. There was no talking their way out of this. No favors to call in. No sympathetic sheriff who would sweep this under the rug. The agent beside Elijah held up a document, the official stamp of the Department of Justice glaring under the fluorescent lights. "Mr. Latham, you and your associates are under federal investigation for hate crimes, conspiracy, and multiple other charges. As of this moment, you are being placed under arrest." Gary's body tensed, his teeth grinding together so hard that his jaw looked like it might snap. He had spent his entire life looking at people like Elijah with nothing but contempt, with the unwavering belief that he was above them, that he would always have the upper hand. But now, as he stood there, staring into the face of the man who had just torn his entire world apart, he realized something. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. The agents moved in then, swift and efficient. Handcuffs clicked into place. Protests were swallowed by the cold finality of reality. The weight of the law, of justice, came crashing down on them like a hammer, and all they could do was stand there and take it. Elijah didn't move as they were led past him, their eyes darting around, searching for some kind of escape, some kind of salvation that would never come. Gary's gaze locked onto his one last time, a final, desperate flicker of defiance in his eyes. But there was nothing left to fight for. Elijah watched as they were escorted out, their shadows shrinking under the weight of what they had done, of what they had lost. Then, he turned back to his mother. Dolores Carter stood exactly where she had been, watching, absorbing, letting the moment settle into her bones. Elijah walked toward her, his voice softer now. "You okay?" She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders finally easing. "I am now." And for the first time since she had stepped foot into that store, she smiled. Elijah exhaled slowly, letting the moment settle in, feeling the weight of what had just happened press into the silence between them. His mother stood steady, her hands now relaxed at her sides, but he knew her well enough to see the way her chest rose and fell just a little deeper than usual, the way she was forcing herself to breathe through everything she had just endured. He didn't say anything at first. He just watched her, allowing her the space to process, to reclaim herself in a moment that had been stolen from her. Dolores finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with something that wasn't quite relief, but wasn't quite pain either. It was something deeper, something she had carried for decades. She searched his face, as if trying to see past the hard lines, past the controlled expression he always wore, past the man he had become to the boy she had raised. "You knew," she finally said, her voice low but steady. Elijah nodded once. "I had my suspicions." She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way only a mother could. "And you didn't tell me." His jaw tightened, and he looked away for a brief moment before meeting her gaze again. "I didn't want to worry you. I wanted to handle it." Dolores let out a slow breath, shaking her head just slightly. "That's the problem, baby. You always want to handle things." Elijah didn't argue, didn't try to explain. There was no point. His mother had always seen right through him. She glanced past him then, toward the store's entrance where the last of the men were being loaded into unmarked cars. She watched them, her lips pressing together, but there was no satisfaction in her expression. No sense of victory. Just a quiet understanding of what had just unfolded. Elijah followed her gaze. "They'll serve time," he said, his voice even, controlled. "This wasn't just about today. We've been building this case for months. There's enough evidence to put them away for a long time." Dolores didn't respond right away. She just kept watching, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her fingers curling and uncurling slightly. After a moment, she spoke again. "You ever get tired?" Elijah frowned slightly. "Tired of what?" She let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no humor in it. "Of fighting. Of always having to prove something. Of knowing that no matter how much justice is served, there'll always be another battle waiting on the other side." He didn't answer right away. He just stood beside her, the weight of her words pressing into him. Finally, he exhaled, his voice softer than before. "Yeah. I get tired." He turned to face her fully, his gaze steady. "But I don't stop." Dolores looked at him then, really looked at him, and for a moment, she saw all the years in his face, the battles he had fought, the weight he had carried, the exhaustion he never let himself acknowledge. Her expression softened just slightly. "I know you don't." They stood there in silence for a moment longer, the quiet wrapping around them like something unspoken but understood. Then, Elijah glanced back at the store, at the employees who were pretending to work but stealing glances in their direction, at the customers who had frozen in the aisles, unsure of what to do with themselves now that the spectacle had ended. His gaze landed on the cashier, the young man who had been so eager to send Dolores away, to uphold the unspoken rules of the town. He was standing behind the register, hands gripping the counter, his face pale and tight with something that wasn't quite fear but was close enough. Elijah didn't move for a moment. Then, slowly, he walked toward the register, his steps measured, deliberate. The store was still eerily quiet, the tension lingering in the air like smoke after a fire. The cashier swallowed hard, his fingers twitching slightly. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Elijah stopped just a few feet from the counter, his eyes locked onto the young man's. "What's your name?" The cashier hesitated, his throat working as he tried to find his voice. "Eric." Elijah nodded slowly. Eric. He let the name settle in the air for a moment before speaking again. You proud of yourself? Eric flinched slightly, his fingers tightening on the counter. I was just doing my job. Elijah's expression didn't change. Your job. Eric blinked rapidly, looking around as if searching for someone to save him, but no one spoke. No one moved. He forced himself to nod. Yeah. I mean, he swallowed again. I didn't mean for it to. I wasn't trying to, Elijah cut him off, his voice quiet but sharp. You weren't trying to what? Eric's breath hitched, his hands shaking slightly now. Elijah leaned in slightly, his voice dropping just enough to make every word feel like a weight pressing against the young man's chest. You thought no one would say anything. You thought you could stand behind this counter, hide behind your register, and let it happen. Because that's what you've always done, isn't it? Eric's eyes darted to Dolores, then back to Elijah. Elijah didn't let him finish. You watched them humiliate her. You let it happen. And for what? To prove something? To keep your place in a town that would turn on you the second you did the right thing? He shook his head slightly. I hope it was worth it. Eric's face crumbled, his breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Elijah straightened, letting the silence settle in, letting the weight of it press down. Then, he turned back toward his mother. Dolores met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Elijah reached for her hand, his grip firm, steady. Come on, Mama. Let's go home. And with that, they turned, walking toward the doors, leaving behind a store full of people who had to reckon with what they had just witnessed. But the truth was, justice wasn't just about what had happened today. It was about what came next. Elijah didn't look back as he led his mother out of the store. The doors swung shut behind them, cutting off the murmurs of the customers inside, the weight of unspoken words lingering in the air like a thick fog. Outside, the street was eerily quiet. The flashing lights from the unmarked cars cast long shadows across the pavement, the rhythmic sound of distant radios crackling filling the silence that had settled over the town like a heavy blanket. The men who had once stood so tall, so sure of their place in the world, were now lined up in handcuffs, their backs to the very place they had ruled with arrogance. Gary Latham kept his head down, but Elijah could see the tension in his shoulders, the barely contained rage simmering beneath his skin. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to being powerless. His entire life had been built on the foundation that he would never have to answer for his actions, that the world would always tip in his favor. And now, here he was, shackled, surrounded by federal agents who saw him for exactly what he was. Elijah stopped just a few feet away, watching as one of his colleagues read Gary his rights. There was no grand speech, no dramatic moment of realization. Just a quiet, methodical process that would lead him down a path he had never expected to walk. Gary lifted his head then, his eyes locking onto Elijah's with something close to hatred, but beneath it, there was something else, something closer to fear. Elijah held his gaze, his expression unreadable. He could see the questions forming in Gary's mind, the desperate attempt to piece together how this had happened, how a man like Elijah had gotten the upper hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Elijah took a slow step forward, just enough to make sure his words reached only Gary's ears. His voice was low, steady. This isn't over for you. This is just the beginning. Gary clenched his jaw, but he didn't respond. Elijah studied him for another second before turning away, his focus shifting back to his mother. She was watching everything unfold, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, her face unreadable. She had seen men like Gary before. She had lived long enough to know that some men never learned, that some would take this moment and twist it into a story of their own suffering, of their own victimhood. But she also knew that this moment was different. This time, there were consequences. Elijah reached for her hand, his grip firm, steady. You ready to go? She hesitated for only a second before nodding. Yeah, baby. I'm ready. They walked toward his car, the weight of everything that had just happened settling into the spaces between them. Elijah could feel the questions forming in his mother's mind, the unspoken thoughts pressing against her ribs, but she stayed quiet. She wasn't ready to ask them yet. He opened the passenger door for her, watching as she slid inside before shutting it behind her. He took a deep breath, allowing himself a brief moment to close his eyes before moving to the driver's side. As soon as he started the car, Dolores finally spoke. What happens next? Elijah kept his eyes on the road as he pulled away from the curb, the flashing lights growing smaller in the rearview mirror. They'll be processed, charged. This wasn't just about today. The evidence we have runs deep. They won't be able to talk their way out of this. Dolores was quiet for a long moment. Then, her voice softened. And what about the others? Elijah tightened his grip on the steering wheel. He knew what she was asking. This wasn't just about Gary Latham and his little group of cowards. This was about the town. The people who had stood by and watched. The ones who had chosen silence. They'll have to live with this, he said finally. Every person in that store, every person who's ever turned a blind eye to what's been happening here, they'll have to face the truth now. No more pretending. Dolores exhaled slowly, turning to look out the window. That's the thing about pretending, she murmured. Some people are real good at it. Elijah didn't argue. He knew she was right. Some people would shake their heads, pretend to be shocked, act as if they had no idea that this kind of hate had been living right next to them. They would call it an isolated incident, an unfortunate event, rather than admit that it had been woven into the fabric of the town for years. He glanced at his mother, watching the way her fingers tapped lightly against her knee, a habit she had when she was deep in thought. What are you thinking about? He asked. She let out a quiet chuckle, though there was no amusement in it. I'm thinking about how tired I am. How tired I've always been. She turned to face him then, her eyes searching his. Do you ever wonder if it'll ever really change? Elijah hesitated for only a second before answering. Yeah. I do. And? He tightened his grip on the wheel. And I keep fighting anyway. Dolores studied him for a long moment before nodding slightly. You always were stubborn. Elijah smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. I get it from you. She huffed, shaking her head. Don't remind me. They drove in silence for a while, the hum of the engine filling the space between them. The weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy, but there was something else beneath it, something quieter. Justice had been served, but justice wasn't the same as healing. Elijah knew that his mother would carry this day with her for a long time. That every time she stepped into a store, every time she saw a man like Gary Latham, a part of her would wonder if it would happen again. But he also knew something else. Today, she had won. Today, she had stood tall. And today, for the first time in a long time, the world had been forced to listen. Elijah drove through the quiet streets, his hands steady on the wheel, his mind anything but. The night had settled over the town like a thick curtain, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. It was the kind of night that felt heavier than it should, the weight of everything that had transpired pressing into the silence between him and his mother. The hum of the engine was the only sound filling the car, a steady, low vibration that did little to drown out the thoughts running rampant in his head. Dolores sat beside him, her fingers lightly tapping against her knee again, lost in thought. She hadn't spoken in several minutes, and Elijah could feel the weight of unspoken words lingering between them. He knew his mother. Knew the way she processed things. She had always been the kind of woman who let things sit before she picked them apart, before she decided what she wanted to say. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice soft but firm. Do you think they're afraid now? Elijah didn't take his eyes off the road. He knew exactly who she was talking about. The men in handcuffs. The town that had enabled them. The people who had stood by and done nothing for so long. He let the question settle before answering. Some of them, maybe. The ones who thought they'd never get caught. The ones who thought they were untouchable. Dolores turned her gaze toward him. And the rest? Elijah exhaled slowly. The rest will tell themselves whatever they need to in order to sleep at night. She hummed in acknowledgement, her eyes drifting back to the road ahead. That's the thing about people, baby. They always find a way to justify their own silence. Elijah tightened his grip on the wheel. He had seen it before, time and time again. People who swore up and down that they weren't part of the problem, that they were good, decent folks, all while standing by and watching the worst of humanity unfold right in front of them. They weren't the ones throwing punches, but they were the ones turning their backs, pretending they didn't see, pretending it wasn't their responsibility. Dolores let out a slow breath, shaking her head. You know, I keep thinking about that boy. Elijah frowned slightly, glancing at her. Which one? The cashier, she said, her voice carrying something almost unreadable. Eric. Elijah's jaw tightened slightly. He could still see the kid's face in his mind, the way his confidence had crumbled the second he realized he wasn't on the winning side of this. The way fear had settled into his bones when he realized that silence wouldn't protect him anymore. What about him? Elijah asked. Dolores was quiet for a moment before answering. I wonder what he's feeling right now. Guilt? Shame? Or is he just mad that he got caught up in it? Elijah thought about that, about the kind of man Eric was, or at least the kind of man he had been today. He had been complicit. That much was clear. But was it out of cowardice or cruelty? That was the real question. Finally, he spoke. Does it matter? Dolores turned to face him fully now, her expression unreadable. It should. Elijah glanced at her, waiting for her to elaborate. She exhaled, shaking her head. People like Gary, they don't change. They don't learn. But that boy. He's young. And the way he looked at you, the way his hands shook, he wasn't sure. He wasn't sure of anything. She let out a quiet, almost tired laugh. You ever wonder how many people like him were just a few steps away from making the right choice but were too scared to take it? Elijah's fingers flexed on the steering wheel. He understood what she was saying, but he also knew that hesitation didn't erase accountability. I'm not saying he doesn't deserve to face the consequences, Dolores continued, as if reading his mind. I just wonder if anyone's ever held a mirror up to him before. Elijah let the thought settle, the weight of it pressing against him in a way he hadn't expected. He had spent his career dealing with people who were too far gone, men who had built their entire lives around hate, who had no desire to change, no capacity for self-reflection. But his mother was right, Eric had looked unsure, lost. He had looked like someone who had never been forced to question his own choices. Finally, Elijah sighed, shaking his head. You want me to go back and give him a lecture? Dolores let out a small laugh, shaking her head. Lord, no. You don't have the patience for that. But maybe someone should. Elijah glanced at her again, watching the way her hands rested lightly in her lap now, the tension in her shoulders finally easing just a bit. Maybe, he admitted after a moment. Silence settled between them again, but this time, it was different. Less heavy. Less suffocating. Dolores shifted in her seat, glancing out the window as they neared home. You ever think about what it would have been like if your daddy was still around? Elijah swallowed, caught off guard by the shift in conversation. It wasn't often that his mother spoke about his father, at least not in a way that wasn't tied to lessons or warnings. Yeah, he admitted. I do. She nodded slowly, her eyes distant. He would have been proud of you today. Elijah's throat tightened slightly, but he didn't let it show. He just nodded. I know. They pulled into the driveway, the porch light casting a warm glow across the front of the house. The familiarity of home settled around them, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. Elijah put the car in park but didn't move right away. Neither did Dolores. She finally turned to him, her expression softer than before. You did good today, baby. Elijah met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. So did you. She smiled then, a real one this time. Come inside. I'll make you some tea. Elijah let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You don't have to. I know, she said simply. But I want to. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Elijah let himself breathe. Elijah followed his mother up the front steps of the house, the familiar creak of the wooden boards beneath their feet grounding him in a way he hadn't realized he needed. The night air was thick, warm, carrying the weight of the day with it, but here, in this space, there was something softer, something that reminded him that not everything in the world had to be a fight. Dolores unlocked the door and pushed it open, stepping inside with the ease of someone who had walked this path 1,000 times before. The house smelled like home. Like aged wood and lavender, like the years of meals cooked in the kitchen, like something steady, something constant. Elijah let the door shut behind him, exhaling as he finally allowed his body to relax, the tension slowly uncoiling from his shoulders. Dolores didn't say anything as she walked toward the kitchen, moving with a quiet efficiency that spoke of routine. The way she pulled the kettle from the stove, the way she measured out the tea leaves with precision, the way she let the silence sit between them without needing to fill it, this was how she processed things. Not with hurried words or forced conversations, but with action, with care. Elijah sat at the table, watching her, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood. He could feel the weight of the night still clinging to him, the echoes of everything that had happened pressing at the edges of his mind. But here, in this house, in this moment, it felt manageable. Dolores finally broke the silence as she set the kettle on the burner, the flame flickering to life beneath it. You remember the first time you ever got into a fight? Elijah let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. You mean the time I came home with a busted lip and you nearly lost your mind? She turned to face him, one eyebrow raised. Nearly lost my mind. Boy, I did lose my mind. Elijah smirked, leaning back in his chair. I was 12. That kid had it coming. Dolores crossed her arms, studying him. That kid was 2 years older than you and twice your size. Elijah shrugged. Didn't stop me. She let out a slow breath, shaking her head. No, it didn't. You've always been like that. Always running headfirst into things, always standing your ground, even when it would have been easier to walk away. Elijah watched her, waiting, knowing she wasn't finished. She leaned against the counter, her gaze steady. And do you remember what I told you that night? Elijah nodded. You told me that not every fight is worth winning. That sometimes, the real victory is in knowing when to let go. Dolores hummed in acknowledgement. And do you think that still applies? Elijah exhaled, running a hand over his face. I don't know, Mama. Some fights don't have a choice. Some fights find you whether you want them to or not. Dolores nodded, her eyes thoughtful. That's true. But tell me something, tonight, when you saw those men getting arrested, when you looked Gary Latham in the eyes, what did you feel? Elijah hesitated. He knew the answer, but saying it out loud felt heavier than he expected. Nothing, he finally admitted. I thought I'd feel something. Satisfaction, maybe. Closure. But there was nothing. Dolores studied him for a long moment before nodding. That's because this fight ain't over, baby. Not really. Elijah frowned slightly, leaning forward. What do you mean? She sighed, crossing the room and sitting across from him at the table. You think because they're in handcuffs, because they're gonna spend years behind bars, that it changes things? She shook her head. It doesn't. Not completely. They're just pieces of something bigger. And you know that. Elijah clenched his jaw. He did know that. He had always known that. The arrest of a few men didn't undo the decades of damage they had caused. It didn't change the systems that had allowed them to exist, to thrive, to walk freely through this town with their heads held high. Dolores reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Justice ain't the same as peace, baby. Justice is about consequences. Peace is about healing. And this town, it's got a long way to go before it gets there. Elijah let her words sink in, feeling the truth of them settle in his chest. Dolores pulled her hand back, sitting up straighter. You're good at what you do. You always have been. But tell me something, when's the last time you let yourself just be? Elijah blinked, caught off guard by the question. What do you mean? I mean, she said, tilting her head slightly, when's the last time you let yourself exist outside of the fight? He didn't have an answer for that. Dolores sighed, shaking her head. That's what I thought. The kettle whistled then, breaking the moment, and she stood up to pour the tea, moving with the same careful precision as before. Elijah watched her, his mind still turning over her words, still trying to make sense of the emotions tangled up inside him. She set a cup in front of him before sitting back down. You need to figure that out, baby. You need to remember who you are outside of all this. Because if you don't, one day you're gonna wake up and realize you don't know the difference between fighting for something and just fighting to survive. Elijah picked up the cup, feeling the warmth of it seep into his hands. He stared down at the liquid, watching the way it rippled slightly from the movement. I don't know if I know how to do that, he admitted quietly. Dolores smiled softly, her eyes filled with something knowing. Then maybe it's time you learned. They sat there in silence, sipping their tea, letting the weight of everything settle between them. Outside, the town slept, unaware of the conversations happening in this small kitchen, of the history that had been made tonight. But Elijah knew that in the morning, when the sun rose and the world kept turning, the echoes of this night would remain. And maybe, just maybe, change had finally begun. The morning light crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the wooden floors of Dolores' house. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, the kind Elijah had grown up waking to, the kind that always seemed to signal something steady, something certain. But today, that certainty felt different. It wasn't just about the comfort of routine. It was about what had changed, about what had shifted in a town that had spent years pretending change was unnecessary. Elijah sat at the kitchen table, his fingers wrapped around a warm mug, the steam curling into the air in slow, deliberate spirals. He wasn't in a rush to get anywhere. For the first time in what felt like years, he allowed himself to just sit, to just be. His mother moved around the kitchen with ease, pouring herself a cup of coffee before settling across from him, her eyes filled with something quiet, something knowing. They're talking, she finally said, her voice calm but firm. Elijah didn't need to ask who she meant. He had seen the headlines before he even got out of bed, had skimmed through the reports, the statements, the inevitable attempts at damage control. The arrests had shaken the town, had forced a conversation that most people had spent their entire lives avoiding. There was no ignoring it now. He took a slow sip of his coffee before setting the mug down. Let them talk. Dolores nodded, stirring her coffee absent-mindedly. Talking is one thing. Doing something about it is another. Elijah exhaled through his nose, leaning back slightly. People like Gary thought they were untouchable. The town let them think that for years. Now, they're sitting in a federal holding facility, and the same people who turned a blind eye are scrambling to pretend they never knew. He tilted his head slightly. But they knew. Dolores let out a soft hum of agreement, tapping her fingers lightly against the table. And what about the ones who didn't know? The ones who never questioned it, never thought twice about what was happening right in front of them? Elijah studied her for a moment before answering. They don't get to be innocent either. Ignorance isn't a defense. Not anymore. She nodded, letting his words settle, letting the weight of them sink in. So what happens next? Elijah ran a hand over his jaw, exhaling slowly. The case goes to trial. The evidence is solid. Gary and his people will do time, real time, not just a slap on the wrist. He paused for a second, considering. And the town? They'll have to decide what kind of place they want to be. This isn't just about them. It's about every place like this, every town that's let hate fester under the surface because it was easier than confronting it. Dolores took a sip of her coffee, watching him carefully. And you? What happens to you? Elijah let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. I go back to work, Mama. I do what I've always done. She raised an eyebrow. And what about what we talked about last night? About letting yourself be something more than just the fight? Elijah was quiet for a long moment before he finally spoke. I don't know how to do that yet. Dolores reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Then maybe it's time you learned. There was something about the way she said it, something gentle but firm, something that made him pause. She smiled then, a small, knowing smile. You can be both, baby. You can fight and still live. You don't have to choose. Elijah held her gaze, feeling the truth of her words settle in a place he hadn't let himself acknowledge before. Outside, the town moved on, as towns always do. People went to work, newspapers were read, conversations were had. But the weight of what had happened didn't fade. It lingered. It forced people to look at themselves, at their neighbors, at the unspoken rules they had followed for so long. Some would pretend nothing had changed. Some would fight against the reckoning. But some, just enough, would start to see the cracks, start to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they had been on the wrong side of history all along. As for Eric, the cashier who had stood behind the counter with his head down, his hands gripping the register as the world unfolded in front of him, he wouldn't forget that night. He wouldn't forget the way his silence had been called out, the way his cowardice had been laid bare for everyone to see. Maybe he would try to justify it to himself, tell himself that he had just been following orders, that he hadn't known how bad it would get. But deep down, he would know. And maybe, just maybe, that knowing would change him. And Gary Latham? He would sit in a cell, stripped of the power he had wielded so recklessly, forced to face the fact that the world had moved forward without him. He would fume, he would curse, he would try to twist the story into something else, something that made him the victim. But it wouldn't change the outcome. He had lost. And the world had seen him for exactly what he was. Elijah finished his coffee, setting the mug down with a quiet clink. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, he let himself believe that maybe she was right. Maybe there was more to life than the fight. Maybe justice wasn't just about taking the bad out of the world. Maybe it was about making space for something better. He stood up, stretching slightly, rolling his shoulders. Come on, Mama. Let's go for a walk. Dolores blinked, surprised, before a small smile tugged at her lips. A walk. Elijah nodded. Yeah. Just a walk. And as they stepped outside, as the sun rose higher in the sky, the weight that had settled on Elijah's shoulders for so long felt just a little bit lighter. Some battles are loud, fought in the streets, in courtrooms, in places where the whole world is forced to watch. But some battles are quiet. Some happen in the spaces between conversations, in the way we choose to see each other, in the way we decide what kind of people we want to be. This wasn't just a story about justice. It was a story about choices. About the people who make them and the people who live with them. What would you have done if you had been in that store? If you had been standing there, watching it unfold, would you have spoken up? Would you have stepped in? Or would you have stayed silent, convincing yourself it wasn't your problem. The truth is, we all make choices. Every day. And those choices shape the world we live in. So ask yourself, what kind of world do you want to be part of? And if you made it this far, if this story made you think, then do me a favor. Subscribe to Tales of Twist and hit that like button. There are more stories to tell, more truths to face, and I want you here for every single one of them.